Betrayal doesn't always come with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes it comes dressed in a smile, hidden behind a lunch invitation and wrapped in false promises. What was supposed to be a simple meal turned into the most humiliating moment of my life, when the very person I trusted the most blindsided me in the cruelest way possible. But little did they know, that single betrayal would ignite a storm they could never outrun. The invitation came to me on a quiet Tuesday morning, one of those days when the office felt unusually calm, as though it were holding its breath. Daniel Hayes, 32 years old, sat at his desk, focused on reports and deadlines, when the message from the CEO landed in his inbox. "Lunch? My treat. Let's talk." Just 6 simple words, but the weight of them was enough to stir something inside him. It wasn't often that the CEO reached out personally. In fact, in all his years working there, Daniel could count on one hand the times he'd been singled out by the man who ruled the company with such confidence. To be noticed at all felt like recognition, and recognition often meant opportunity. For a fleeting moment, excitement raced through him. Perhaps his hard work had finally been seen. Perhaps the late nights and endless sacrifices were about to pay off. The hours leading up to that lunch stretched in a peculiar way. Daniel tried to keep busy, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the invitation. He rehearsed possible conversations in his head. Maybe the CEO would talk about a promotion or about entrusting him with a new project. Maybe he would be asked to join a special team or even offered a raise. The possibilities were endless, and though Daniel tried to temper his expectations, he couldn't help but let hope creep in. His colleagues noticed the faint smile he carried all morning, the way his usual seriousness had softened with a spark of curiosity. No one else had received such an invitation. It was just him. That in itself felt significant. By noon, Daniel had convinced himself that this was the start of something new. He smoothed down his tie, polished his shoes on the office rug, and took a final glance in the mirror before heading out. The restaurant chosen by the CEO was one of those upscale places Daniel rarely visited, the kind where the lighting was soft, the air smelled faintly of expensive wine, and every detail seemed designed to remind you that you were in the presence of power. The CEO was already seated at a corner table, waiting with a practiced smile, the kind of smile that didn't quite touch his eyes. Daniel didn't notice at first. He was too caught up in the moment, too eager to believe this meeting would change his life for the better. As they exchanged greetings and settled into their seats, Daniel felt a mixture of nerves and pride swelling in his chest. This was his chance. The waiter poured them water, menus were opened but hardly glanced at, and the CEO leaned forward as though about to share something confidential. The tone was casual at first, the kind of small talk that dances on the surface without revealing the depths below. Daniel laughed at the appropriate moments, nodded when expected, and waited for the conversation to shift into something meaningful. He imagined the CEO was leading up to it, easing into the subject before dropping the news of opportunity. But there was something else in the way the CEO spoke, something Daniel couldn't quite place. His words were smooth, his gestures calm, but underneath there was an unsettling edge, like a blade hidden beneath silk. The meal arrived, plates arranged perfectly, aromas drifting upward, yet Daniel barely tasted a thing. He was focused on the man across the table, waiting for the moment when his future would be laid out before him. His pulse quickened with every pause, every deliberate sip of wine the CEO took. The restaurant around them carried on in its usual quiet elegance. Couples dined at nearby tables, business partners murmured over contracts, laughter rose in small bursts from across the room. To Daniel, it all felt distant, like a backdrop to the only scene that mattered, the two of them sitting across from each other, bound by an unspoken tension. The invitation had promised significance, and Daniel was clinging to that promise with every fiber of his being. This wasn't just lunch. This was a turning point. He could feel it. And yet, as he looked into the CEO's eyes, he noticed a flicker of something else. Coldness, perhaps, or calculation. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by another polite smile, but Daniel's instincts stirred uneasily. He pushed the doubt away, telling himself it was nothing, that he was overthinking. Still, a quiet unease settled in his stomach, whispering that this lunch wasn't quite what it seemed. The CEO's invitation had pulled him out of the safety of the office, placed him here in this quiet, polished arena, and Daniel realized he was completely exposed, waiting for words that could either raise him higher than he'd ever dreamed or drag him down in a way he hadn't yet imagined. The moment came without warning, delivered not with sympathy but with a cold bluntness that struck harder than any insult. Daniel had barely lifted his fork to take the first bite when the CEO leaned back, folded his hands on the table, and spoke the words that made the air around him tighten. "Daniel, I'm going to have to let you go." Just like that. No lead-up, no explanation, no soft cushion of reasoning. The very words he had least expected were placed before him like a dagger, sharp and unapologetic. For a second, Daniel didn't process it. The world around him seemed to stop, his thoughts froze in a haze of disbelief, and his body refused to move. He blinked once, twice, hoping he had misheard, but the CEO's expression didn't waver. The polite smile had vanished, replaced by a look of authority that carried no room for negotiation. Confusion spread across Daniel's face as his mind scrambled for answers. Just this morning, he had walked into the office believing in his future, believing that his years of loyalty and tireless work meant something. And now, here in a public place, stripped of the comfort of his desk or the respect of privacy, he was being told his career was over. The CEO spoke as though it were nothing more than business, as though Daniel's livelihood, his sacrifices, his late nights and missed birthdays were items on a checklist being crossed off with ease. The lack of hesitation stung more than the words themselves. Daniel felt a surge of heat rise to his face, a mixture of humiliation and anger that churned inside his chest. He wanted to protest, to demand an explanation, but the CEO's tone left little space for interruption. Every word carried finality. "It's not personal, Daniel. These things happen. The company has to make changes." Not personal. How often that phrase was used to disguise cruelty. To Daniel, it was personal. Every moment of exhaustion, every ounce of dedication he had poured into the company was deeply personal. And now, in front of polished cutlery and half-filled glasses of water, he was being cast aside as though none of it mattered. His thoughts tumbled in 1,000 directions. What about the projects he had been leading? What about the trust his team placed in him? What about the years he had given, the promotions he had earned, the loyalty he had never once wavered from? The CEO's gaze was steady, his words precise, but his detachment only deepened the wound. Daniel's silence stretched for too long, and in that silence, he realized the cruelty of the setting. Here he was, surrounded by strangers who had no idea his entire world was collapsing, expected to keep his composure while his dignity was stripped from him. Every bite of food around them seemed louder, every clink of glass a reminder of his vulnerability. Daniel had been invited to lunch not as recognition, not as appreciation, but as a stage for his dismissal. The betrayal twisted in his gut, leaving a bitterness that no fine wine could wash away. The lunch that had once filled him with nervous hope had turned into a trap, a cruel performance where he was the only one who hadn't known his role. He stared at the man across from him, the man who had delivered the blow with the calm precision of someone who had done it countless times before. Daniel felt small, invisible, discarded, and yet, beneath the weight of humiliation, something stirred inside him. It wasn't just sadness, nor was it simple anger. It was the first spark of something sharper, something that cut through the fog of confusion and betrayal. The realization that this wasn't the end, this was only the beginning of something else entirely. Daniel barely had time to process the sting of being fired when the CEO leaned in with a casual, almost careless addition, as though what he was about to say was simply an afterthought. "We've already chosen your replacement," he said, his tone light, as if discussing a menu choice rather than a man's future. Daniel's heart pounded, his breath caught halfway in his chest. Replacement. The word echoed in his mind, hollow and sharp, but what followed cut even deeper. "It's the owner's nephew. Fresh out of college. We think he'll bring in new energy." The words hit like a slap across the face, not only confirming Daniel's dismissal, but degrading it further. He wasn't being replaced because of incompetence, or because he had failed in his role. No, he was being pushed aside for someone who hadn't walked a mile in his shoes, who hadn't fought through the late nights, the endless demands, the years of proving his worth. A nephew, chosen not for skill or dedication, but for bloodline and favoritism. Daniel's jaw tightened as the humiliation deepened. All his years of effort had been reduced to nothing more than a stepping stone for someone who had merely been born into the right family. He tried to keep his composure, but inside him, a storm raged. How could they? He had built systems, nurtured client relationships, kept entire projects from falling apart when others had failed. He had been the one staying after hours to make sure deadlines were met, the one sacrificing weekends to ensure everything ran smoothly. And now he was expected to hand over all of it to someone who had done nothing to earn it. The injustice burned in his chest like fire. The CEO didn't even seem to notice the turmoil in Daniel's eyes. He spoke smoothly, sipping his drink, explaining the decision as if it were just another strategic move. "You understand, don't you? The owner wants his nephew to get some real experience. It's important for the family." The family, that single word told Daniel everything. This wasn't about the company, about progress, or even about him. It was about nepotism, about power, about connections that ran deeper than merit ever could. His career, his livelihood, his reputation, they were nothing compared to the whim of the family. Daniel sat there feeling the weight of every moment pressing down on him. The injustice wasn't just in losing his position, it was in being replaced by someone so undeserving, someone who had yet to prove themselves, someone who would walk into the office tomorrow and take over everything Daniel had worked to build. He pictured the smug smile of a privileged young man stepping into his chair, inheriting his hard-earned respect without lifting a finger. The thought twisted inside him like a knife. Around them, the restaurant continued as though nothing had happened. Glasses clinked, forks scraped plates, laughter floated from nearby tables. But Daniel felt as though he had been placed under a spotlight, every second of his humiliation magnified by the indifference of the world. The CEO, unaffected, spoke with a calmness that only deepened the cruelty. It wasn't just that Daniel was being discarded. It was the casual way it was being done, the effortless dismissal of his worth, the replacement framed as a necessity rather than the blatant betrayal it was. His throat was dry, his pulse a steady drum in his ears. A part of him wanted to lash out, to shout the unfairness for the whole room to hear. Another part wanted to walk away, to leave the CEO sitting in his own smug silence. But deeper still, in a place the CEO could not see, something else began to grow. A thought, dark and sharp, whispering through the haze of humiliation. They thought they had won, that they could strip him of everything and replace him without consequence. But Daniel knew better. This wasn't just the end of a job. This was the beginning of a reckoning. Daniel sat frozen, his mind battling the humiliation of being discarded like trash. When the true sting of the moment settled in, not just the firing, not just the replacement, but the raw public exposure of it all. The CEO hadn't chosen to do this behind closed doors, in the privacy of an office, where dignity could at least be preserved. No, he had orchestrated this at a pristine restaurant where every sound echoed too loudly, where strangers' eyes might drift across the room and witness Daniel's downfall. It wasn't just a dismissal. It was a spectacle, a humiliation disguised under the elegance of wine glasses and polished silverware. Daniel's thoughts spiraled. He saw flashes of his past, the endless hours at his desk, the emails answered at midnight, the way he sacrificed weekends and relationships, believing it was all leading somewhere. He thought of the moments when colleagues had turned to him for solutions, when clients trusted him to deliver, when he had proven again and again that he was indispensable. And now, all of it was reduced to a single cruel sentence, erased in favor of the owner's spoiled nephew. That realization cut deeper than any insult. His entire identity at the company, his years of sweat and devotion, had been dismissed in less than a minute. The CEO continued speaking, his words laced with that hollow corporate politeness that only added salt to the wound. "Don't take it personally. You've done good work here." Daniel clenched his fists under the table, his knuckles whitening as he struggled to contain the flood of emotions. Good work? If his contributions had truly mattered, he wouldn't be sitting here, staring across at a man who treated him like an inconvenient detail. He realized then that loyalty meant nothing in this world, not to men like the CEO, not to families like the owners. To them, employees like Daniel were tools, to be used until they no longer served a purpose, and then discarded without a second thought. Humiliation burned through him like fire, but beneath that fire a colder emotion took root: betrayal. He thought back to the times the CEO had shaken his hand, told him he was valuable, praised him in front of others. All lies. Every word had been a mask, covering the truth that Daniel had never been anything more than expendable. The cruelty of it twisted his insides, but it also sparked something else, a seed of defiance. If they believed they could humiliate him, strip him of his dignity, and move on without consequence, they were wrong. Very wrong. He looked around the restaurant, the laughter and chatter now mocking in his ears, each sound amplifying his shame. He felt like the walls were closing in, that every diner could sense the humiliation radiating from him. His pulse quickened, his chest tightened, but he forced himself to sit straighter, to meet the CEO's eyes without breaking. Inside, however, his thoughts were a storm. The humiliation wasn't going to fade with time. It would carve itself into his memory, fueling something larger. Betrayal had a way of shaping people, of turning pain into power, and Daniel knew in that moment that he could never forgive what had been done to him. As the CEO calmly lifted his glass, sipping wine as though he hadn't just torn a man's life apart, Daniel made a silent vow. This wasn't the end of his story. The humiliation would not define him. Instead, it would ignite him. What the CEO and the owner's nephew didn't realize was that they hadn't destroyed Daniel. They had created something far more dangerous, something patient, something calculating. And one day, when they least expected it, they would see just what their betrayal had set into motion. Daniel left the restaurant with his chest tight, his steps heavy and his pride shattered into pieces. But by the time he reached his car, the fire inside him had already begun to burn in a different way. The sting of humiliation was still raw, but underneath it, a razor-sharp clarity began to form. They thought they had stripped him of everything, but what they had really done was awaken a side of him that had been buried beneath years of loyalty and blind dedication. Daniel wasn't just angry, he was calculating. He realized that revenge, to be satisfying, couldn't be impulsive. It had to be deliberate, crafted like a masterpiece, timed so perfectly that the people who thought they had control would watch their own empire unravel piece by piece. That night, Daniel sat alone in his apartment, replaying the scene over and over in his mind. Every word from the CEO, every smug look, every casual mention of the nephew, it all etched itself into him, fueling the determination that now coursed through his veins. He wasn't going to shout, he wasn't going to beg, and he wasn't going to crumble. No. He was going to plan. He knew the company inside out. The weaknesses in its structure, the shortcuts the leadership took, the hidden skeletons buried beneath glossy presentations. He had been the one keeping things afloat while others reaped the glory. And now that they had discarded him, he saw every flaw with unclouded eyes. As the hours passed, Daniel began outlining steps in his head. He knew where the numbers didn't add up, where the CEO had covered mistakes, where the nephew would inevitably fail if the right pressure points were exposed. He had contacts, too. People who respected him, who had confided in him over the years about shady dealings and unethical decisions. He hadn't realized it before, but he had all the pieces to a puzzle that, once assembled, could collapse the very foundation the CEO and the owner's family stood on. What they saw as weakness, the fact that he had been quiet, observant, and dedicated, was now his greatest weapon. The image of the owner's nephew sitting in his chair, fumbling through responsibilities he couldn't possibly understand, made Daniel's resolve solidify. He could almost see the young man's arrogance, the smug confidence of someone who had never earned his place but had it handed to him. Daniel knew it would be easy to let him trip over his own incompetence, but that wasn't enough. The downfall needed to be bigger, louder, undeniable. The kind that would stain reputations, the kind that would remind everyone watching that betrayal always carries a price. His anger no longer controlled him, it sharpened him. Every detail became part of a larger strategy, every memory of loyalty now transformed into fuel for vengeance. Daniel realized he didn't just want to make them regret what they had done. He wanted to take away the very things they had stolen from him: respect, security, and power. Revenge wouldn't be about a single action. It would be a chain reaction, carefully set into motion, unstoppable once it began. As he stared out the window at the city lights, Daniel's reflection in the glass looked different, harder, colder, more determined. He wasn't the man who had walked into that restaurant expecting recognition. That version of him had been buried the moment the CEO smiled and said he was letting him go. What had emerged instead was someone stronger, someone who no longer believed in fairness or loyalty, someone who had nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing left to lose was the most dangerous kind of enemy. The day of reckoning came faster than Daniel had anticipated, not because he rushed, but because arrogance always accelerates downfall. The CEO strutted around the office as if untouchable, and the owner's nephew wore Daniel's former title like an ill-fitting suit, throwing his weight around without understanding the smallest detail of the work he was supposed to manage. Daniel had kept silent, watching from the outside, feeding just the right information to the right people at the right time. The company's clients began to lose trust when the nephew fumbled meetings. Their investors started asking questions when reports didn't add up, and whispers of misconduct spread like wildfire once Daniel ensured the evidence landed in the right inboxes. The cracks grew visible, no longer something even the CEO could hide behind his polished charm. Investors demanded answers, and board members started questioning his leadership. Behind the scenes, Daniel had handed over years of carefully documented proof, the overlooked irregularities, the quiet cover-ups, the careless shortcuts. It was more than enough to shake the company's foundation. And when it all came to light, the CEO found himself cornered, his authority bleeding away in front of the very people who once praised him. As for the nephew, his downfall was swift and merciless. His incompetence was no longer a private joke whispered in corridors. It became public humiliation. Clients openly rejected him, staff refused to take his direction seriously, and soon enough, even the family who had forced him into the role couldn't protect him. He wasn't just failing. He was crumbling under the weight of expectations he had never been prepared to carry. Daniel didn't need to be there to witness every moment. The updates came to him anyway, carried by people who once worked beside him, people who now celebrated his quiet genius. They had seen what he endured. They had seen how unfairly he was treated, and when the truth surfaced, they recognized who had lit the fuse. The CEO and the nephew had believed Daniel's silence was weakness, but they didn't realize it was patience. Patience that had turned into precision. Precision that had turned into destruction. And then, as the company's reputation collapsed in on itself, Daniel walked away with something far greater than the position they had stolen from him: vindication. The empire that had humiliated him over lunch had eaten itself alive, and all it took was a man they thought powerless deciding he would no longer be their pawn. They had underestimated him, discarded him, and mocked him. What they never expected was that their betrayal would become the very weapon of their undoing.